Hey everyone, welcome to Wildlife Inspired. I'm your host, Scott Keys. In today's video, I'm going to show you 5 mistakes that beginning photographers make when editing their photos. And by the way, some intermediate photographers make these mistakes as well. I'll show you what they are right after this. Now, in today's video, we're going to talk about some of the mistakes that people make when editing their photos. Over the years, I've seen millions of photos of wildlife, and I've seen these themes develop over time, some common mistakes that people make. And in today's video, I want to show you 5 that I've identified. We're going to look at them specifically. I'll show you what they are and maybe give you some hints on how to correct those mistakes and how to avoid them in your photography. But let's jump to it with the first mistake that people make, and that's overcropping. Now, in the image I've brought up, we've got a dunlin on the shore, and it's got some moss in the foreground, a nice morning glow in the background. And while I like this environmental scene, a lot of beginning photographers really want to hyper focus on the subject. And it's difficult to get close, so we often end up overcropping to feature the subject. Now, there are a few problems with that. I'm going to take this image here, which was originally around 5,000 pixels wide, and I'm just going to bring it down to about 1,500 pixels wide. This is going to give us a focus on the subject, and if I enlarge that, it would look something like this. Now, I'm shooting this with the highest quality lenses and the highest quality camera possible, but I'm still going to lose a lot of detail when I crop in this close. One of the things about resolution is as you crop down, the image size becomes very, very small. So while the subject will get larger in the frame, the quality of that subject, the details will start to disappear. It can create a lot of issues around image quality. While you may not see this when viewed on a very small device or when viewing it on social media with low resolution, when you will see this is when you go to view on a large monitor or especially when you go to print. When you bring an image down to 1,500 pixels wide like this one, the print size is limited to about 5 to 7 inches wide while maintaining resolution that the human eye feels is still good. So could you print this and could you view it? Well, yes, it wouldn't have a ton of detail, but what you will not be able to do is to print this large or to view it large on a monitor. In fact, on some of our modern monitors, this image would appear so tiny that it would be very unpleasing to the viewer. So to avoid this mistake, if you are subject-centric, if you are trying to get close details of the subject, you're really going to have to focus on getting closer to the subject in the field. So your field craft is going to have to improve. And the second part of this, to avoid overcropping, is just to think about, can I go ahead and feature a scene, something like this, rather than just focusing on the subject itself? Is that something that you're comfortable with? So my first mistake for beginning photographers is just the overcropping of their images, which results in poor image quality. And when viewed on larger monitors or when you're attempting to print these images, it's really, really challenging. Now, the second mistake I wanted to share about editing is overdoing the sliders. There's 2 sliders I'm going to focus on in particular for this video, and that's the sharpening and noise reduction sliders. Now, I've opened this image up in Adobe Camera Raw. You can open this up in Lightroom if that's your editing software of choice, but noise reduction and sharpening are very common features in any software that you use. There's a big difference in the quality that you get from that, but all softwares in today's market are probably going to offer you an availability to do some noise reduction or some sharpening. Let's take a look at this, and I've opened up the details panel down here. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit tighter on this image. We're going to go all the way into 200%. You can see in the original image, I've got pretty good feather detail around the head. You can see right around the rim here along the top. You can see each of the individual feathers there. And I've got some decent sharpening. Not the sharpest picture I ever took, but this is very satisfactory sharpening. What a lot of people want to do is make it sharper. And the big mistake here is sharpening an unsharp image to begin with. But even with a sharp image, when we take that sharpening slider and we feel that it does us a better result, what happens is our backgrounds are going to start to get a pattern to them, and the image itself will become over sharpened, and it's not pleasing to the eye. It may look good when it's very, very small or on a small device, but when viewed larger, you're going to see a lot of added grain, and you're going to see a very harsh feeling subject. When we try to reduce noise in an image, a similar thing happens, but it's the opposite effect. We actually start to lose detail. So as I raise that slider up, Look what's happened to the feathers. They've started to melt away. Now, I mentioned that there's a difference in software. Some software can handle this much better than other softwares. But in general, noise reduction is applied globally for most softwares. And the user has to then finesse it with what we call masking. So taking parts of that image and sharpening it and taking parts of that image and applying noise reduction. Again, there are some softwares out there like Topaz that do some of that for you. But even in the best softwares, if we overdo the effect, it can be very unpleasing. One point to really avoid is using both sliders at the same time. So when I increase noise reduction and increase sharpening, I get a very unflattering effect. These feathers will start to look like an oil painting. It gets very washed out. It doesn't look real. It almost looks like an animation. I'm going to take you down to the moss down here. You could see how it started to lose its detail, but it doesn't feel realistic anymore. So whatever you do, please avoid overusing these sliders. Maybe look at some better software if you're interested in this, but never pull those sliders up at the same time because you're going to get some really unrealistic effects when you do that. Now, the third mistake I see people make when editing their photos, especially in the beginning, is unnatural lighting. I'm going to give you two examples of this. The first one is going to be how we change the temperature of the light to simulate golden hour. I've pulled up an image that I shot years and years ago. This is a buff-breasted sandpiper. I was really excited because it was a nice bird. You could see that the light is not very flattering. There's not a golden tone to this. It's very white, very bright, and very hard. A lot of people will try to simulate golden hour by going into the temperature slider. Now, almost all softwares have a slider that will adjust the temperature by making the image warmer. In this case, moving a slider to the right. And when you think warm, you're thinking of oranges and yellows. When you think cool, you're thinking of blues. I'm going to slide this to the right, and I see a lot of people pretending that they shot this at golden hour by just warming an image. This is a very unnatural feel. The colors start to look off, and as any experienced photographer can quickly pick up on this shift in color. It's not very flattering. Another mistake that people make is going the other way. Let me show you another image. This is an owl that was captured at night, and the light here is very neutral, meaning there's not a warm tone or a cool tone. This was late at night. Often people will go back into that slider. I'm going to open it up here in Camera Raw. And they'll adjust temperature possibly the other way. And they'll give it a bluish feel. So they'll simulate a blue hour look. This slider is equally dangerous because if you go too far with this effect, it starts to give a very unnatural feel to the image. There's not a lot of light that will look like this to your naked eye. So when we pull these sliders in either direction, it starts to look unnatural. Now, artistically, you may adjust these sliders a little bit and it might give you a look that you want. But when you take that slider either way, too warm or too cool, it gives a very unnatural feel. So avoid that unnatural light when you're editing your photographs. Now, another editing mistake that I see that beginners make, but also sometimes intermediate photographers, is the lighting doesn't balance between the subject and the rest of the scene. I'm going to show you an example of this. I've got a short-eared owl up here, and you can see that the scene is underexposed. And one of the trends is to lift the exposures on the subjects and keep the backgrounds dark. That makes the subject stand out. And there are some lighting situations where naturally that can work out really well. What I tend to see is something that looks like this. In editing, we select the subject and we just lift the exposure, often universally, meaning the exposure is lifted everywhere on the subject, and it makes it stand out almost like a cutout. Now, the effect isn't very natural because it looks like there's a spotlight that's hitting just the bird and the rest of the scene is dark, and that doesn't generally happen. And when it does happen, if you're in one of those unique lighting situations, you normally won't get this very universal feel to the light. There'll be some shadows and some shape to the light. It won't feel really flat. Now, this happens a lot on backlit images. So I'm going to show you another image over here, and this is a black-necked stilt. And you can see the light is coming from behind the bird, and that results in some shadows there. The shadows on the bird may feel a little flat, but that's the effect that natural light will give you. The temptation is then to lift the exposure evenly and make it stand out even more so we can see the subject. And when we do that, and we lift the exposure universally, it starts to feel a little fake. It stands out as artificial. The light, even the tone doesn't really match up, and it doesn't feel like a naturally lit photograph. So, when we are lighting our subjects or altering exposures, you need to be very careful about how far you go with that and the shape that you give to the light on there. Now, I cover some of this on my Patreon site. If you've never heard of that site or explored it, you can sign up for free, but there's a subscription-based site where I teach a lot of these techniques to naturally make your editing look better and avoid some of these common mistakes. So down in the description, you can check that out. But let's talk about the fourth editing mistake that I see from beginners, and that's this: halos. Now, what do I mean by a halo? A halo is when we have something around the subject that stands out. It's often like a glow that appears around the subject. Now, more to come on this because there's a lot of ways to create these halos, but I'm going to show you two ways that I've seen, and one of them I really frown upon. But let me show you the first way, and that's when we lift the exposure on our subjects like we might have done with the other photos, but we don't do it precisely. And often it gives us a glow around the outside. So I've lifted the exposure here, and if I look closely around these edges, you're going to see a slight glow that goes all the way around the subject. That glow can be very unflattering, and once you've seen it, it's hard to unsee it. I see that occur a lot with just lifting shadows. By the way, if you're developing your skills in Photoshop, masking can help that, meaning you are very selective about which parts gets applied. But when you do some of this in a software program, it may not have that fine-tuning ability, so you'll be left with these remnants. So when you brighten the exposure in an area, sometimes it'll glow around the subject. Here's another example. This is a sky replacement. Now this one I really don't like. I really encourage people to avoid this. This is a mistake all unto itself. But what I want you to notice is right around the bird, the sky replacement can't always be perfect. So some of the original sky is left in there, and that blue sky from the original image is showing around the subject, and we've replaced the background with some clouds. Now those pretty extreme example of haloing, and again, it can occur a lot of different ways, but I do see this mistake a lot. I would encourage you to really check the areas around your subject, regardless of what editing techniques you're doing. If you've made adjustments to your photo, especially around the subject or the background, look at the areas around the subject. And again, if you haven't explored Photoshop, there is a technique called masking, which can help you refine some of that. And the last mistake I want to share with you today is not editing your photos at all. I'm going to talk about this one for a little bit with an image of an Avocet. Now, this is a raw file image. This is taken right out of the camera. And out of the camera, it's got so much potential. I can see the potential there, but I also know this is not what my eye saw that day. When I say the mistake is not editing your photo at all, I want to talk about this mindset because I hear it a lot, especially with beginning photographers. I want it to be natural, or I want it to be untouched. Maybe they say things like, I'm a purist. I want to shoot it right out of camera. I want to show you what my camera saw. But we have to be very careful with this concept, because when we say what our camera saw, we have to also understand that's not what our eyes saw. Our eyes are subjective, by the way. We have a very tough time saying this is what my mind saw and replicating it perfectly. We are often subjects of bias. So for example, in this scene that night, I remember this magic light that just glowed in the background, and it had this great combination of cool tones and warm tones, and it was saturated and it was gorgeous. But that's what my mind remembers. The camera is going to take a file. There are two basic files that a camera will shoot in, and one is called a RAW file, and another one is called a compressed or JPEG file. And some cameras may have different formats in addition to that. The compressed format will give you an output based off of what you tell the camera to do. So I want my scene to look natural. I want it to be vibrant. There's a lot of settings in there, and that will change the output of your camera. So to think that our camera isn't subjective is also a lie. The camera is subjective to some point because we can tell it what to do. If we shoot in a RAW format, those formats have a lot of data, and they're designed to be manipulated. They're actually designed to be edited. They give you a very flat output like this, but this is not what my eye saw. So if I sent this out to people, or I said, here's what I saw that night when I was shooting an Avocet, that wouldn't be a realistic depiction of what I actually experienced that day. Now, this concept about subjectivity and what our eyes see and what our camera takes and purity, probably a video for a whole topic just around that. And we could have debates and talks about it. My goal is to create the prettiest image that my camera can capture. So I take that raw file, I try to replicate what I saw, but also what I felt. Let me show you what I felt that day. This is what I felt. This is what I experienced. To my mind's eye, this is much closer than what the camera produced. So I'm not encouraging people to learn how to digitally manipulate files. I'm not encouraging people to say, like, I have to over edit my photos. And I showed you some of that over editing, the over sharpening and what can do with that, the over noise reduction and how that can have a bad effect on your images. What I am encouraging you to do is explore things like basic contrast and lighting values, and maybe learn a little bit about how light works and how those edits can be enhanced by understanding things like saturation, contrast, brightness, and then maybe making some selective changes to the images. And we might call that dodging and burning, lightening an area and darkening an area to give it some more effect. Even the great film photographers use those techniques. So it's up to you. What's your comfort level with this? But I would say a lot of purists may not understand a lot of the concepts behind this. And once you start to play around with editing, it opens up a whole world of what you can do to sometimes an otherwise very bland image. And that's my video for today. I'll list over here those 5 common mistakes. I'm going to do some follow-up videos around this concept of editing photos and maybe highlight a couple of these and show you even more examples. So stay tuned. If you're not subscribed to the channel, you're going to want to hit the subscribe button now. Little bell for notifications will let you know when I have a new video out. Hope you enjoyed this video on editing. And as always, I hope we can continue to find inspiration in wildlife together.